Welcome to Conversations with Thought Leaders. And I'm here with my guest, Brad Walsh. And we're going to be talking today about the role of the story doula. It's hard to say. The role of the story doula. But we're going to come back to that. Let me first introduce you to Brad. Brad is a testament to a life dedicated to empowerment, inspiration, and making a positive impact. He has a podcast called Empowerography, and he's a devoted father to two remarkable daughters. He understands the significance of nurturing potential and fostering growth, cultivating compassion. And alongside his role as father, he's also a devoted husband. He was a photographer and still is a photographer. And this is where story began for Brad. It intersected with his innate drive to uplift others. And during the pandemic, this is where he birthed the concept of empowerography. And maybe you're getting the connection. It is the connection of empowerment and photography. And it's an innovative platform that amplifies the voices of strong, dynamic women. What began as a concept blossomed into a global phenomenon, positioning Brad as the catalyst for change. He's authored a number one international best-selling book, become a two-time international best-selling co-publisher, showcasing his commitment to sharing impactful stories. His creations are beacons of hope, spotlighting human triumph and transformations. But his heart lies in empowerography, where he bridges the gap between host and advocate. And in each episode, he invites listeners into a world where women's stories empower change. Welcome, Brad. I know you well because I was on your podcast and it was an amazing, amazing experience. So, welcome.
Oh, Andrea, thank you so much for inviting me into your space and to be part of this platform and share a little bit about the role of a story doula as you newly, quite recently crowned me. I appreciate that. It's an honor to be here with you. And it was an honor to have you on the podcast to share your personal story and journey. I know it was a beautiful conversation. And I'm very grateful and thankful for being connected to you and to be able to call you a friend and to be here with you today. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Brad. That is so kind. You and I have had many conversations, and I
hmm
think for most people, as they look at you and what you do, I guess one of the first questions is, how did you bridge that gap? How did you go from photographer to story doula? And what made you want to start to uplift women? What made that become the thing that you wanted to do in the world?
Well, I mean, photography, my journey into the photography world goes back quite a few years. I learned how to shoot on black and white film back in high school. I took photography in high school and worked in the dark room and all those beautiful tools and lovely things, the smells, all of that stuff. That's where my journey started into photography. But as far as the women's empowerment space, that journey for me didn't start till about 7 years ago. Actually, it's 7 years this July. I have been working in the women's empowerment space as a photographer and as a podcast host producer. Um, my daughters are a huge part of that inspiration for how that all began. Both my girls were bullied in elementary school, and seeing what they went through, and then taking a step back and looking at the whole picture through a wider lens, the fact that there are so many hundreds of millions of young girls and women who go through and deal with these kinds of things on the daily basis. The photography piece of it broke my heart, of course, because they're my girls. But when I thought about all the women who go through that, to be able to provide that gift and to be able to have an impact on another human being's life in that way, to show them themselves in a light that they don't normally get to see themselves in, was just an incredibly beautiful gift for me, being on the other side of the lens to be able to do that for another human being. And it got to a point with the photography where I felt like I wanted to have a bigger impact. I wanted to reach more people. And of course, with the photography, the impact is very minimalized because it's really basically my client and I who feel the effects of what we're creating together. And I wanted to have a bigger impact. I wanted to reach more people. So I thought, well, why don't I take the values, the purpose, the mission of that work I'm doing as a photographer to help uplift and empower women and to show them who they truly are, and turn that into or transplant that into a podcast where I focus the podcast solely on women. And at the time, even now for that matter, I don't know of any platforms out there that are hosted by a man that solely focus on highlighting and amplifying women's voices and elevating them through sharing their stories. So I thought, well, this is a great niche for me to carve out in the podcasting world. Because of course, as we know, as entrepreneurs, as podcast hosts, you have to do something to make your business or your podcast or whatever it is stand out from the crowd. And so I thought this is perfect. So I reached out to 7 or 8 friends of mine, women who I had met through my photography work and journey, photographers, makeup artists, and I explained what the idea was for the platform. And of course, back then it was only in its infancy. The podcast is now, it just turned 4 last month. And
Yeah.
so I asked them if they would help me get the platform off the ground by letting me interview them. And thankfully, they said yes. So I did the interviews, I created the content. And at that time, I was only publishing an interview every 2 weeks, I think it was. Um, and also at that same time, my photography business, because I had been 2 years into my full-time journey as a photographer, the business started to pick up. I was getting more inquiries and more bookings. And I thought, well, I have to shift my focus and my energy to the business. I left my corporate career of 12 and a half years for a reason to start the business. So I thought I have to put my energy there. So I shelved the podcast actually. So I call that 8 episode run my dress rehearsal. And I shifted my focus to the business. And then, of course, we fast forward to March of 2020. And well, we don't even need to say the word. We know what happened. And it rendered my business inoperable. So I thought, well, Brad, you've got two choices here. You can either sit around and commiserate with everyone else around the world that's complaining about what's going on, or you can take advantage of this gift of time and use it to put something good out into the world. So I thought, I'm going that route. I'm going to go through door number two. So I thought, I'm going to reignite the podcast. I might as well. I've got nothing else I can be doing. So I started reaching out to women on Instagram, explaining what the idea was behind the platform, what I wanted to do with it, where I wanted to take it. And it was received so well. Women were so happy to hear that a man had created a platform such as this to help elevate women and amplify their voices, that I had women saying to me, Brad, I've got a friend, she'd be a great guest. Brad, I know someone, I'll introduce you to her. And it just grew into this incredibly beautiful community that we now have. And I just published my 580th episode today, and
Incredible.
it's been amazing. It's been
Congratulations.
such an incredible journey. Thank you.
Yeah, that is quite a story. And I mean, I think, as a storyteller,
Hmm.
it is powerful to hear your own story. And I think, I do a lot of work in storytelling, you do a lot of work in
Yeah.
storytelling. And one of the things that I've seen happen again and again is, where somebody hears their own story back. And the shift and the change that it makes in them. And I'd love to hear from your perspective because, we started as you and I were talking and we came up with this idea of the story
Mhm.
doula, you being the
Yeah.
story doula, because you're pulling stories out. I think we all live our lives and we don't think of our lives as a story. Of
No.
course, we're living it real time, but there's so much richness in the lives that we live. And in retrospect, there's so much that we've learned, so much that we've grown through and experienced. And when looked through the lens of story, what
Mhm.
happens is we start to see ourselves differently. So tell me a little bit about your job as the story doula in pulling the stories out of women and what has most surprised you? And as you work with women, what
Mhm.
most surprises them?
Well, I think what surprises me the most is of all the women I've interviewed, the incredible resilience that these women have. I honestly think to myself sometimes as I'm sitting there listening to their stories and we're going through the interview, I'm thinking, how are you even still standing after what you have been through, and you've come out of it and you're on the other side of it now? But how did that not destroy you, what you went through? So I think resilience is probably one of the biggest things that I've noticed that is an incredibly common thread through all the women that I've interviewed. And hearing these stories, I mean, some of the stuff that I've heard is just mind blowing. I've had women share things with me that they said they've never shared with anyone else. And for me, to hear that and to be part of that. I look at what I do when I'm interviewing women for the podcast as I my guest and I are in a car. I'm in the passenger seat and she's driving the car, and the car is taking us on the journey of her life, of her story. I'm a passenger, and the fact that I get invited into that space, Andrea, is so incredibly, it's such an honor for me to be invited into that space to share in that, because you have to know how to listen to people when you're helping
Really,
pull a story out of. That
that's
is one of the most important qualities and skill sets in a podcast host, in a story doula, in a storyteller. You have to know how to listen to people, and you also have to make them feel heard and seen. So to be able to do that, I think it takes a lot of practice. It's a skill set. It has to be learned. And everybody can learn it, absolutely. I've found that a lot of people through the podcast, and people don't listen. A lot of people don't listen. They listen. You can almost see when you're having a conversation with someone, you can almost see the wheels turning. They're trying to formulate their answers before you've even finished getting out of your mouth what you're trying to say. That is, you got to listen, not listen to
yeah.
respond. You have to truly listen.
And I couldn't agree more. I mean, that idea of, I'm already formulating my response before, before you've even finished it's what actually in many cases we've been taught, right? Because
Mhm.
we've been taught that, a conversation is an exchange of back and forth of ideas.
Yeah.
And while that's true, really what it is it's reacting and absorbing what you're being told first, and then,
Mhm.
exchanging your thoughts on that, not the I'm gonna one up you, or
Yeah.
I've got an even better story than your story, 'cause and that's a lot of times what happens, right? And
Yeah.
and so, when you're working with women in
Mhm.
the role of story doula, in this role of pulling the story out, um, do are they surprised by what you hear when you reflect it back to them?
Yes, I've had guests tell me, I know, when we're in conversation. And yesterday I was actually interviewing a woman from Ireland, and we were talking about her story and her journey. And I was expressing to her how incredibly resilient I thought she was and how powerful her story was. And she said, "Thank you. I don't hear that very
Yeah,
often from people." So, yeah, reflecting back, echoing back to them that you are strong, you are courageous. I was doing a discovery call this morning with a woman another woman in Ireland, actually, and she was telling me she works a lot with women, and she was saying that a lot of women, they don't believe in themselves and they struggle with that piece of it, and they don't think they have a story. I said, I know that's very common. A lot of women do say, who am I to tell my story? I don't have a story. Who wants to hear my story, or things like that. And then she proceeded to tell me that she doesn't think she has a story. This woman started 3 businesses. She's opened off like, she's in Ireland, she opened an office in New York City for her business, and she started 2 other businesses. Like, you have a story. You're an incredible human being. So, I think that they get so caught up in just the day to day and doing their thing that they don't realize how powerful they are or how much of a story they have. Those are
mhm.
2 examples right there.
And what happens when, in helping somebody to hear their own story, to
Mhm.
see their own resilience, to understand themselves in a new way, what happens? Do you see changes in these women? Like, like, what happens for you? Like, I mean, a lot of episodes, like, I am imagining that you have seen a lot of change.
Oh, tons. It's incredible. I think first and foremost is the self-acceptance. And
Mm,
realizing that, wait a minute, it's like that, you hear coaches say, like, I'll ask coaches, a lot of coaches I interview, and ask them, what is it that lights you up or excites you the most? And they all say it's that light bulb moment. That's exactly what it is. You see that light go on in their eyes when you're talking to them, and reflecting back to them what they've just told you. It's like it's like this thing firing off in their brains, like, yeah, you're right. Thank you for pointing that out, or thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your insights from your side of the story, from what you're hearing reflected back. So it's seeing that light go off in their eyes. It's incredible to be able to do this work and to be able to give back in that way. that they realize, wait a minute, I am powerful. I do have a story to tell.
And as you think about, you're a father, you're a father to two daughters, you're a
Hmm.
husband. um, your your platform is about empower. um, what is it? Empower, educate, and elevate, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And so that empowerment piece,
Hmm.
what brought you to that? Why empower?
I think, well, it started with the photography, right? The boudoir photography, empowering women, and really it is just showing, as I said before, showing women them who they truly are in a light that they don't normally get to see themselves in.
Mm,
It's giving them, with the photography piece in particular, and even with the podcast, is giving them the confidence or showing. And when you show someone who they truly are, that gives them a boost. Like I I see it each time I have a session with a subject, with a client who comes in for a photo shoot. They come in, and of course, I mean, boudoir photography, they're basically standing in their bra and underwear in front of a stranger, basically.
mhm,
And so it's very vulnerable. They're nervous, understandably, 100%, I get it. But by the time they leave after that session, it's like they've got this new air about them. They walk taller, they walk prouder, and it's this boost of confidence. And I've even had clients, when we're finished with the session, I'll say, "Okay, we're done. We've got enough images. We're good. That's a wrap," kind of thing. Like, "Oh, I was really just getting into this and enjoying this." So to see that that sense of self, that sense of
mm,
that's empowerment. That's being able
right,
to provide that gift for someone, to give that to somebody is such an incredible gift for me.
mhm.
Selfishly, I mean, I love that I get to do that. It feels so good to be able to do that for another human being and create impact, and for them to feel that, and for me to have been part of it.
Yeah, and I think there is something really powerful about the fact that it is, like you said, boudoir photography, where it could be seen as very, um, the opposite of empowerment
Yeah.
often, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean,
Mhm.
certainly when we look back in the past at that type of photography, it was really about, creating, objectifying women.
Yes.
And so to have shifted it from an, objectification to an empowerment is
Mhm.
really, really powerful. And I think what I'm hearing about, like, from you, and also what I know of you, is that you really do see yourself as an ally to women. And so how did you shift that? How did you take this medium that was something that was seen as more of an objectification and move it into an empowering medium?
I think it's about creating comfort, um, creating a space where there's trust. That's the most important. That is paramount. Is that you create that bond of trust. I create that bond of trust with my clients, and that starts right from the moment I get an email saying I'm interested in booking a session. We get on a call. I set up discovery calls, or what do I yeah, discovery calls with them, and I have a questionnaire that we go through, and I talk about what one of the first questions I ask them is, why do you want to do a boudoir shoot? What
Mhm.
is it that's intrigued you to do this? And so establishing that level of trust right from the get-go, right from that very first email, that first bit of contact is so important, because that leads right through to the actual photo shoot. Then, of course, the viewing session after the shoot is done, you have to keep that trust and that bond between you. And I also love to create an environment in the studio where it's light and we have fun, we joke around. And I think it's also important as a photographer, and I know a lot of photographers don't do this, but show your client the images, show them the back of the camera as you're capturing the images. Because I mean, I would say 98% of these women have never had a photo shoot before. So they're
Wow.
sitting, they don't know what to do. You have to guide them. That's what a
Right.
good photographer does, is tells them how to pose and guide them and help them, and showing them the back of the camera so that they know. I'm sure they're sitting there wondering, well, is this guy capturing anything good? Like, what do these
Right.
images look like? So I always make sure I'm constantly showing them the back of the camera so that they know. this is what we're capturing. You're doing amazing. And it's that constant encouragement during the shoot as well. You're doing amazing. You're doing great. You look great. All of these things. And for me, being a male photographer, I also make sure that, again, it's about the trust, is my makeup artist stays with me the whole time. So there's another
Mhm.
woman in the studio so that they do feel comfortable the
Right.
whole way through. That is incredibly important. Trust is paramount in that environment. So you create that right from the very beginning.
I've got two thoughts that come up as you're talking. So, I mean, the first one is this, the questionnaire. Why are you doing this?
Hmm.
And I think that is such an important piece because,
Yeah.
I think without that, without creating an intentionality
Hmm.
around the shoot, what could happen, because I'm sure no one is saying, "Oh, I'm doing this shoot so that I can, post it onto my media,"
No.
right? That's not what it's for, right? I'm sure
No.
that shoots are really some form of risk that this person is taking, um,
Hmm.
with their own self. They're stepping into who they are, and so that piece kind of leads to the next thing that I was thinking as you were talking, which is,
Hmm.
you know, as a storyteller
Hmm.
and somebody who actually pulls stories out of others, you know, going from photography into podcasting, into writing, and into programs, the through line that, like, tell me how they all connect. Like, how does boudoir photography
Hmm.
connect to the podcast, connect to the books in terms of storytelling?
Yeah, well, like I said, the golden thread there is storytelling, but it's about providing a space. I mean, photography is visual storytelling. So it's providing that space for a woman, a client to step into who they are, right? And then the podcast that ties through to the podcasting where I'm providing a platform for them to share their stories. I'm helping them dig in and find their stories and pull them out of them to share because stories, I mean, storytelling has been around for hundreds, thousands of years. So we all have a story. And, as I said before, there are a lot of people, I don't have a story. Who wants to hear my story? Everyone has a story. And I think it's your responsibility to share it with the world because undoubtedly your story will inspire at least one person out there in the world, and that's what it's about, is helping, reaching, and inspiring people through your experiences, through your story. We all are unique. You have a story and
Mhm,
you need to share it because it will inspire someone. So then right into the podcasting is helping them pull their story out, and that's the whole goal of the Empowerography platform, is to help reach and inspire as many women as we can through sharing these all of these women's stories. That's what it's about. And then of course into the writing, sharing our stories again. It's about telling that story with the hopes of reaching one person to inspire them. Maybe, and I think it's also a permission slip when we share our stories, whether that be through visual storytelling, through the podcast, through writing our story. It's a permission slip. When we stand up and share our stories, it gives others permission to stand up and share theirs and know it's okay. Hey, Andrea went through this. She shared her story. I've got a story too. I'll
mhm,
share it. Or maybe Andrea's story helps prevent someone who's going through a similar thing to avoid some of the pitfalls that you went through
mm,
your story.
yeah,
So it's about that. It's about inspiring, but it's also about giving other people permission, having the courage to stand out because it takes a lot to share your story. It
it
takes a
does.
lot of strength and fortitude and inner strength to stand up and share your story. So when you see others who are doing that, it gives you the permission, it gives you a bit of strength and a boost to do the same.
Stories are absolutely life changing. We, as you said,
Hmm.
we all have a story. We all we all hear ourselves in each other's stories.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that, I talk a lot about is that when we share a story, not only are we understanding the story itself, but we're also understanding often the more complex topics that live under that story, because
Hmm.
stories become metaphors and
Yeah.
they become ways for us to understand something that, we might not have had access to without the story,
Yeah,
because complex topics can be hard. And suddenly we tell a little story and we go, oh, that's what you meant. And so our life stories are these backdrops behind these, powerful and complex lives that we're all living. And,
absolutely.
my world, I talk a lot about how, the transformation from expert to change maker
Hmm.
into thought leader is actually through story, because
Yeah.
it is what an expert or a change maker learns how to do well, so
Hmm.
that their content is more understandable. So as you think about, the work you're doing
Hmm.
with women, what happens when you find somebody who maybe doesn't understand how to tell a story? Are you helping them along the way? Are you pulling it out of them? Are you giving them a framework? How does that work?
Yeah, well, with the podcast, what I do is I create questions based on each of my guests' bios. So they send me their bio, which of course is a bit about their story, who they are. I ask for specific things in the bio. I ask them to give me a bit of background on their story, how they got to where they are today, what the journey was for them, and what they do. So what I do is I create questions based on that bio that will help to pull the story out of them, because a
Mm,
lot of people, like I said, it takes courage to stand up and tell your story. And a lot of people don't know how to tell their story. So I think that providing or doing things the way I do, the format I do with my podcast, is it makes it so much easier. It makes the process easier for them to share their story, because I'm kind of guiding them through the questions that I create to pull their story out of them, which I love. It's absolutely wonderful. And a lot of people say, well, that's questions, doesn't that, like, that's what's a formula that sounds very rigid, and but it's not. When you listen to an episode, it flows, and
close.
if we go off in another direction, that's okay.
That's okay. Actually, we've got a question from
Mhm.
Aritra Mukherjee who says, what about leveraging story for personal branding?
I think that personal branding, that's you are your brand, so
Yeah.
let's tell your story through your brand. I think it's key. That's what a good brand is. It tells the story of who you are.
And I think, just to add on to that is, you are the brand, you are your
Hmm.
story. And I
Yeah.
think, underlining all of that, and I think what our stories do is they exemplify our personal values,
Yeah.
and because our stories really are based in what we value and what we bring. And so when we use our story to build our brand, which of course we should,
Hmm.
what we're actually doing is building a brand that's based in values. And
Yeah.
that's a brand that actually has impact.
Absolutely. I mean, stories give us insights as to who you are. It
Yeah.
shows us who you are. It's so important. It is, stories are,
Demonstration.
yeah, absolutely. So yes, your personal branding, tell your story through your brand. That you are your brand, as you said, Andrea. So yeah, that's personal branding and storytelling go hand in hand.
Brad, I think we could talk all day about
We
this,
could.
you know, and like the time goes so fast.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to first of all thank you. This has been absolutely a pleasure,
Mhm.
and a delight to just talk about story with somebody who truly understands and appreciates it. It has really been my pleasure. So thank you, Brad. Do you have any last anything in closing to say to our guests today?
Just find your story, dig in and find your story, because it is there within you, and it's your duty and your responsibility to share it with the world. Someone will benefit from it. So I know it takes strength and courage, but dig in and find your story, and you need to tell it. It's needed in the world. Your story is needed.
Amazing. And you can find Brad at empowerography podcast.com. We're going to have the his all of his contact details in the show notes, so make sure to check them. I know Brad is always open to chatting with
Yeah.
people, and I know he also has a very, very active group on Facebook. Empowerography
Hmm.
is what it's called, right?
Podcast Lounge, Empowerography Podcast Lounge.
Yeah. So check that out as well.
Mhm.
And make sure to watch his podcast. They are amazing. He does a great job, and he has the most interesting women telling, as you can tell, amazing stories. So thank you again. And thank you to everybody who's joined us here today for our conversations with thought leaders. We'll be live in 2 weeks on June 7th with my guest, Mike Lipkin, where we'll be talking about mindset and how you need to show up to be the best you can be, because it's all about belonging. So thank you again, Brad, and thank you for all who joined us, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Andrea, thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor and pleasure. I appreciate you. Thank you,
Oh,
everyone, for tuning in.